Hey everyone, Warwick's here. So a few hours ago, Blizzard put up a video on its YouTube channel. It's quite long. You can't see it by the camera, but it's about 44 minutes long about, as you can see the title at the above my head here, how Warcraft is improving its UI. Now, I'm a mostly base UI user. I have very few add-ons that I use that actually transform the base UI. There are a couple of things that I use, things like adding map coordinates to the map, and then some quality of life add-ons, things like auto selling, junk, things of that nature. But like my bars, my unit frames, with the exception of my party and raid frames, I use Cell for that, just because the functionality and the default ones isn't there that I feel like I need. And then nameplates are the other one that I use. I use Plater for that. But beyond that, I'm mostly a default UI with weak auras added in, and then things like DBM and a few other like quality of life add-ons that, to me make my experience better. Better Blizz frames is the big one that I use to allow for things like the class colors being put on and things like that. So I'm curious to see what this video is going to be about. I've seen like the one big thing that's been catching a lot of people's attention and dominating the conversation, but I want to talk about some of the other things that I see. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through this video. We're going to watch a good chunk of it, and I'm just going to react to things that I'm hearing. I know that Dratnos, who's content creator, and Max, the leader of the GM of Guildmaster of Liquid, are in this with Ian Hazacostas, so we will see. But I want to kind of talk about this because if there's more than just this one thing, then I want to be able to discuss it.
Welcome to a special edition of WoWcast, where we're going to talk about a patch 11.1.7 feature, and then a broader discussion about add-ons in World of Warcraft in general. I'm Dratnos, World of Warcraft content creator.
I'm Max. I'm the raid leader of Team Liquid, the WoW Guild, and a content creator as well.
And I'm Ian Hazacostas, game director on WoW, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Very excited to be here. So what are we doing in 11.1.7?
A whole bunch of fun stuff, but one of the features that we're extra excited about is a new UI option that we're adding called Rotation Assist, which is really designed to help players who are maybe picking up a new spec or want some guidance on what abilities they should be using when, without having to turn to third-party add-ons for it. So we've seen that, there's an add-on called Hekili that is very popular with a lot of players. We're basically building in a very similar version of that into the base UI that you can opt into. That will, no matter what DPS spec you're playing, highlight the recommended next ability given your current energy, what's going on around you, and so forth. One extra thing that we're also going to do, which maybe goes a bit beyond what the add-ons can do, is also have a one-button version of that, where there'll be like a keybind that if you just want almost an auto rotation, you can opt into that, and it will just automatically cast the next recommended ability in the sequence. There'll be a small GCD penalty associated with that, but we want to make sure that this is for accessibility purposes, that it's there for people who maybe just honestly aren't interested in the gameplay of like mastering their spec. They want to explore Azeroth and experience the story, and the mechanics kind of get in the way of that sometimes. This should be for them. Ideally, this is not a tool where someone is like being told by their raid leader to stop trying to DPS manually and just turn on the one button mode to meet some DPS check. That we want to give you the tools to kind of go through that organic progression naturally.
Okay, so this is the big one. Obviously, it's dominating the conversation piece. I'm actually generally speaking in favor of this. So as someone that plays a lot of alts, there are a few specs that I feel like I'm too stupid to know. Fire Mage being the biggest one that I always think of immediately. To some extent, Preservation of Ochre. I'm curious how this is going to work on healers and tanks. Obviously, he mentioned specifically DPS. So I'm curious to know what the impact on healers and tanks are. Maybe they talk about it here shortly. We'll see. But I'm generally speaking in favor of this because Hekili, yes, it's a very popular add-on. I don't use it. I like to kind of figure out the rotations on my own, or pull something up that is like been theory crafted and practiced on a target dummy or whatever the case may be. This could potentially cut down a lot of that time. And there are some specs that I probably will go in and try it on just because I think I know what the rotation is. And then it turns out that it's not, or I follow the WoW guide as best I can, but then it turns out that like, hey, maybe this one actually ends up being a little bit more damage. Um, the other thing that I'm curious about is how is it's gonna to be able to suggest a bunch of situational awareness stuff, and you're still gonna have to be able to react to that, which I find interesting, and how it's gonna do that. It almost feels AI-ish, which I don't like, but that's kind of the idea, I guess, that I'm getting out of it. So we'll see. Generally speaking, I am in favor of this. I could think of a couple people in my guild that I think would really like something like this without having to go get another add-on and keep that updated and keep track of it. They can just turn on a feature in the base UI. That'd be really good. And then the one button thing, like honestly, like I'm even down for it for like for me as someone that doesn't necessarily enjoy world content, just turn on the one button for when you're leveling and just go through and experience it that way. Like there are definitely benefits to being able to do that. The fact that he specifically mentions, your raid lead is telling you to go one button mode, and you saw the reaction of Max and Dratnos, both of them like immediately nodded their heads. Tells me that that was probably one of the very first things that came up when they decided to have conversations about putting this feature into the game. So I find that really, really funny.
Great.
But the rotation assist doesn't come with a penalty or anything like that. That's just we're going to show you what your next button is.
Exactly.
Right.
It's very similar to the Hakili add-on. It's kind of reflecting, just the latest kind of established theory crafting, and it's something that we would continue to update, with spec changes and class changes over time. Ideally, it all's born out of the idea that we've seen a valuable tool that players feel like they should be looking outside the game to download, and we'd rather just reduce the barriers to that and make it available to everyone.
Good.
Okay, yeah, because there's two parts of it, right? Like the advanced is I want to really go into this is the one button thing, but that's not necessarily everyone that's going to use this. Like I think this game, especially new players getting into it, there's a lot going on within a particular class, and you can be a little lost trying to figure out exactly what I should be pressing. So even just using it as like as a guide to start learning your class and move off of it eventually, but just having a base understanding of what actually should I be doing at a base level of this.
That's really exactly.
I agree. I think it's really good, honestly, even for existing players. Like, I mean, I've got guildmates and friends that, they have other characters because they just like leveling characters. But for example, I know some of them are like they're straight up one tricks of their spec. Maybe and it's maybe because they like have this fear of switching specs and then having to learn all of that again. This can help reduce that barrier to entry. And some specs seem like they're really like it's really funny to me how people think that certain specs are very, very complicated and they're not, and then people that think there are certain specs that are very simple but they're not. And it's some of it's colored by experience, some of it's colored by not understanding design. Like there are people that think Demonology Warlock is really hard. It's actually not. Demonology, a lot of longtime Warlock players will tell you right now, if you're like a brand new Warlock and you just want to get the easiest spec to kind of pick up and learn so you can build yourself a decent foundation, a lot of them will recommend Demonology because it is straightforward. Now, there is a skill cap in how you do your Demonic Tyrant windows and stuff like that, but every spec has, for the most part, has something like that. And that's what separates new players from good players from great players. Whereas like Arcane Mage, I mean, currently they have to have a weak aura that tells them when to use one of their abilities because all the conditions that make it so that when it's appropriate to use are so complex that like you just can't calculate and look at all the information and figure it out fast enough in a lot of cases. So does this take someone like I'm thinking of like my fellow officer he absolutely adores Destruction Warlock. He plays it no matter what. But he's even mentioned in the past, do I pull out Affliction? And this could be a way for him to be able to start getting some of those baseline fundamentals of Affliction under his belt in a way that allows him to do it with, opening up his menu and putting a feature in rather than having to go download and maintain an add-on. So yeah, I agree with that. I agree with what Max said there quite a bit.
The motivation on our end. I mean, especially with warbands and War Within, we see lots and lots more alts and leveling is pretty quick. You got a bunch of Warbound until equipped gear that you're passing over to a new character, and just jumping into their full rotation, you've never played the spec seriously before, can be a pretty serious undertaking. And
Also correct.
for some people, this may be enough for them, and that's fine too. But we recognize that there's so much. WoW has such a high skill ceiling that just recommending what the next ability isn't going to really remove that or fully solve that. There's still the muscle memory that you need to form, and then all of the nuances of like.
I love how they show a Windwalker monk right here. Double blackout kicking.
We might have a recommendation for a rotation that makes sense if you're fighting a target dummy, you're fighting patchwork. But when you need to plan around the fact that you're going to have to move in 4 seconds, that's a whole different layer of skill that still rests with players.
Yeah, I know when I'm trying to play a new spec for the first time or haven't played it in years, it often feels like I've got like a 30-minute checklist of, okay, I got to set up my keybinds, got to make sure, oh, this ability's changed since 2 expansions ago, I got to rebind that. And then I got to go and read some guides and figure out how all my new rotation works, and oh, here's how the new set bonus works. So I could see it being really nice to just have this is a way to jump into some content to do with your friends and have it work out nice and easily. One thing that jumps out to me is that a lot of the content I'd want to do would be like delves or keys. And in either of those cases, there's a lot of AoE.
Yeah.
Is this going to have are we going to detect whether we're fighting 3 targets, 5 targets, and is it going to cast my Arcane Explosion instead of my Arcane Blast, or is it just always going to be a single target?
It's not just single target. There is some sense of how many enemies are within your range, in front of you, etc. And so that will affect the recommendations. Again, the goal is not optimal. The goal is not like this is going to okay, everyone's always going to get perfect parses and so forth going forward. But as a baseline, this should be it should be useful the same way that many people find Hakili useful today. And it really a lot of this building on the foundations of the cooldown manager that just came out in 11.1.5 kind of reflects us hearing people in the community telling us that they feel like they need to seek out these third-party resources just to play the game at like a baseline effective level in competitive content. And us asking is that where we want the game to be in the long term, and what can
I'm not even going to listen to the second half of that statement. He's correct. One of the things that people love about things like Final Fantasy is that everything in the game, yes, they ban add-ons, but they also do a really good job of fundamentally designing the game to tell you everything you need to know. And yes, there are some tooltip readings and stuff like that are required, but they do a good job of doing that. And you've seen and Blizzard is kind of catching up in a lot of ways to that sort of modern game design philosophy of clear visuals of where abilities are going to be hitting and stuff like that. Or sometimes they overdo it, but they're there, and now they're doing things like the cooldown manager. It's been, I think it's got potential. I think it needs some refinement, but I think it's got some potential. And now we're getting this. We're starting to see that, and the cooldown manager is designed really to kind of chunk away at the need for class weak aura packages. This is obviously down, attacking directly Hakili. When they mention it by name, it kind of makes it obvious what they're kind of mimicking this off of, and going from there. So let me so I can mute these pings that I'm getting in Discord.
can we do to build in native solutions to many of these problems?
Like the base construct of it, there is this will help you learn what you're supposed to do if you are new. And then there is hey, I don't want to be the best player at this game. That's totally fine. I play it for a different reason. I want to collect things. I want to understand the story. I want to quest. I want to level, right? And I don't want to feel like I can go into any content and I just don't really know what I'm doing. I feel anxious about that. You have the ability to just be like, okay, well, at least Blizzard's got me. I can have something at a base level where I can press one button and just kind of hang out and play the game. I have one question about the actual rotational thing. So is that going to change with talents? So let's say, is it going to work off the base talent build, or let's say you select a talent that now moves a AoE button into your single target rotation? Is it going to be smart enough or planned to be smart enough to incorporate a bunch of different potential talent builds?
The goal is that it's aware of your talents, and the logic is conditional based on what you do or don't have talented. As with, this is going to be something that continues to evolve. We may not have every single possible permutation accounted for in the version that we roll out with, but it should still be very useful in that form to everyone, and we'll just get refined from there. Similar to the cooldown manager that we know is like, that is a first take at this. We have plans to add much more customization, much more functionality to that over time as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting feature individually. The thing that's most exciting to me is in the broader context of the cooldown manager, of all these other edit mode changes that have come out. There was a time 5 years ago in WoW where if you were just getting into the game, there was an intimidating list of these are the add-ons that you need, and if you're not using these, you're kind of worse, right? Like you're noticeably worse. If you can't track your group members' major cooldown, right? Like you're worse at Mythic Plus than somebody who is, right? And it seems like the goal that has been accomplished with a lot of these things that have been coming into the base UI is you can use those add-ons if you want, but we now have a native way to the game that you don't have to get an add-on.
That is pretty much exactly our long-term philosophical goal here, right? Like, add-ons are amazing. The things that the community has done over the last 20 years to allow people to experience different aesthetics, different functionality, have information available at their fingertips, like, that is a huge part of WoW's success, and we don't question or want to undermine that for a moment. At the same time, like as you said, ideally it is about what do you want? How do you prefer to have things presented to you? And not what do you have to do? What is a group mate or raid leader or whatever telling you you must download? Or if you ask people, hey, how can I get better? Or, I'm really struggling at this. The first answer shouldn't be, well, download this add-on, this add-on, and this add-on, otherwise you're doing it wrong. Because that's starting to get into that mandatory place, whether we like it or not. So yeah, I think,
He's correct. I remember that even back in the day, like, when you, even in Classic, that was kind of a thing where people would be like, you have to have Recount, you have to have Omen Threat Meter, you have to have, Deadly Boss mods at the time. Big Wigs eventually came a little bit later. Those were, if you were raiding, those were requirements for everyone to have. Like, you didn't have any choice but to get them. And then, add-ons continued to evolve. Like I remember O unit frames, which was a Lua based one where you had to actually edit it in the Lua, not by opening a menu. And shadowed unit frames, which is still very popular. X Pearl came out about during this time. Like all these add-ons started to provide even more information than what the Blizzard base UI did, and as a result, like, they felt like they were more mandatory because you wanted to have that information, but at the same time, you couldn't get it from the base game. And for a long, long time, Blizzard just didn't have any care for that. Like, they just didn't seem to put any effort into it. They'd make small UI adjustments every now and then, but for the most part, like, the first time that we got that UI overhaul was Dragonflight. That's 19 years into the game's life. 18 years into the game's life? That's crazy to me. And so, long term, like, I still think there are going to be some quality of life, accessibility stuff that will probably always be out there, or alternative ways of, like, sorting. There are certain add-ons that I would love for them to absolutely brick the hell out of, but it's really hard to do that without kind of bricking your game too. So we'll see. I like the fact that they are taking on this philosophy. They seem to be treating it seriously. And, if we're getting a new kind of add-on feature every single time that there's like a new 0.5, 0.7 patch, I'm not upset, especially if they can implement it well. Like I said, the cooldown manager, you even mentioned, it's like a very first take on it, and there's a lot more they want to do with it. Hopefully we can get to a point within like 3 years, maybe by the end of the World Soul Saga, where, the UI that I use now, or someone that's using Tuck UI or Elv UI, can get all of the functionality that they want without installing a single add-on. Now, is that going to be true across the board? No, I don't. I have no doubt that it won't be. And I think there are certain people that are also not ever going to get away from from add-ons because of what they can do and stuff like that. But I admire the goal. You know, you can put all the tools in front of your player base and go from there. Like there are certain fundamental things that now they need to now focus on, but adding in these like little on the edge stuff, I think is a good way to start. And then they need to look at some of these longer ones. Hopefully they get to it later in this cast.
Longer term, these initiatives kind of fit into part of how we're thinking about the role of add-ons in WoW. As we can probably all agree, today there is a sense that if you want to really be the best you can, if you want to play competitive content, there are certain add-ons that are required, that are simply going to improve your success over not having them, period. We would like to get away from that being the case. I think I'd love to see a WoW one day where you can still customize the aesthetic look of your UI, you can have information and quest helpers and all the other things that you might want to have to make your experience a bit more seamless. But that at the end of the day, when you're in competitive content, when you're queuing up for a rated PvP match, when you're going into a high key, when you're trying to get a first kill on a raid boss, there isn't the sense that you are just holding yourself back if you're not using specific tools. We know that there's a lot of work to do to get to a place where that could be the reality. The first steps really are going to be continuing to build up the just right out of the box functionality that World of Warcraft offers to shrink that gap. But at the same time, I think we're aware that at the very end of this process, we probably are going to have to rein in some of the functionality that add-ons currently have to do like real-time in-combat problem solving specifically, where it's like,
Yes, I like this. Um, the bosses that are least fun to me are the bosses where a weak aura solves all your problems. I hate bosses like Obanax, where a weak aura solves your problems. I hate bosses like Echo of Netherian, where a weak aura solves your problems. Uh, Even to a lesser extent for Rock, where you had Shadow Orbs versus Fire Orbs, you just got a weak aura that told everyone where to stand. Some of that is going to require that Blizz come down on the complexity of their mechanics and get back to just straight up DPS checks being, in heal checks, and even, give a fight or two that has a tank check and allow it to allow players to have the creative freedom to be able to solve the problems that work best for the team that's in front of them. The game is so complex that you kind of have to follow a core strategy developed by like two guilds and tweak it for your own purposes. But like, I remember on Serpent Shrine Cavern, Lady Vosh, there was like 6 different ways you could do that boss that all were viable depending on what your team could be. I would love to get back to that. So yeah, I really like the fact that the fact that he acknowledges that they have to rein in the functionality of add-ons, I think is very, very important for people to know.
automating coordination, communication in ways that are always going to be better than anything the UI could natively provide you as long as they remain possible.
Yeah, so that moves us into like raid bosses where I don't want to name any names, but there are people who have optimized a little bit of their own fun out of the game sometimes. I don't know where any of them might be sitting. They could be anywhere. They could be in this room with us.
Yeah.
Hey man, I am the like number one. Let's just YOLO this. Let's just do the fight. Let's make it work. And then sometimes it gets to let's try to make something that could be 95% successful, 100 or 99, right? And there's a lot of frustration with the tech involved with that. I would definitely be. I think a lot of the rating community would be pretty for that. I think a well-designed mechanic that the game giving you enough information to solve this on your own realistically. A lot of the times the community will just use one because it's like what everyone else uses. It gets you in the same place. But if that doesn't exist and the game is giving you that information, it's objectively better, right?
And even if you are doing it very well, manually, it's always going to be better to do it perfectly in a competitive situation. I mean, having watched, your raid leading, for example, over many, many years over the race to world first, like years ago, you would call much more stuff verbally.
Very
like
true.
going back to,
Yeah.
Legion, BFA era, whereas nowadays it seems like if there is something you're calling repeatedly on attempts, the first thing you're doing is asking if, hey,
Trying to
can we automate this and get me out of the business of talking, which seems like it might be less enjoyable for you as a raid leader.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if we're talking about that, I could talk all day
Sure.
about that. Yeah. No, I mean, I mean, I felt like you certainly had more of an impact when you had the ability to, influence the fight more. But the reality is just getting some way to automate it for your players is just better. It is funny. Like when I do that now, I think, what else can I be doing with my time? I could be like looking at other ways to optimize, and it's purely for the sake of getting better. So yeah, for my own enjoyment, yeah, that's sweet. Let's do that. I'm trying to wonder also about those kind of mechanics. So like what bosses have existed in my head, I think in the past couple of years, there's not many, but have been defined by when we're progressing this boss, we feel like maybe we're progressing a weak aura. Something like Brood Twister or Echo of Neltharion or Jailer maybe was one of the first ones, right? And those mechanics, I feel like, could not have been done or probably would have been nerfed without weak auras or having that effectiveness of that reduced. What do you do as a fight designer now? Do you I know you're obviously like really passionate about raiding. You've raided for a really long time. What do you have to avoid those kind of assignment mechanics? Are there things in game you can use to like naturally sort out those things? Like, do you give more time for the mechanics? Like, do you have to stray away from assignments in general because the community has just, whether you like it or not, has like trained themselves to have something solve that for them? Do you have to like go back into like a more simple version of that? Do you find other ways to make fights difficult? There's obviously a bunch of ways to do that.
The way we design encounters has been influenced in significant ways by the way players use add-ons. I know, the community sometimes
Yeah, I could have
regulates,
told you that.
this was built clearly to require an add-on. I can say that's never the case. No encounter designer is ever sitting around saying, all right, we're going to make this mechanic, and then players will write this weak aura to solve it this way. All right, mission accomplished, let's ship the boss. But when we're thinking about the overall pacing of a fight, the tuning, we might get feedback on a fight that it feels like there isn't enough going on, when in actuality, there are 4 or 5 mechanics going on, but add-ons are largely compartmentalizing and making it so that most players don't have to think about them most of the time. And then players give us feedback that, hey, this fight felt a little bit slow, like I was just punching the boss for 3 minutes. And so then maybe we add another mechanic in the next iteration of that or a similar encounter. We get to a higher overall complexity space where, there's just, you look at the dungeon journal and you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and maybe half of it doesn't even matter because add-ons are going to handle it for you. I think that's not a great place for things.
If you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling in the dungeon journal, that's a fundamental flaw of the dungeon journal and the fight design itself, in my opinion. Like, the number of times like I've tried to explain to my raid, hey, this is what happens in early phase 2, and people just tune it out is wild because they just listened to me explain the 5 different mechanics that happened in phase 1. Like, yeah, add-ons can do a lot. Weak auras can do a lot for that. But at the same time, they really need to also think about like how much is too much, because as a raid lead, I've experienced it, particularly this tier, where I might as well not be in the raid so that I can just call it. And I'm in a mid-mythic guild. Like, our goal is to get 6 mythic bosses this tier. We are entering mythic very late. Like, there are, we're still working on Gallywix as I record this for heroic, trying to get AOTC. Our goal is to get into mythic within 6 to 8 weeks of the raid being released, and we're about to hit week 8. Like, we're starting to get to our point. We're still working on Gallywix, and some of that is, there's a variety of factors for that, but like at the same time, like, if I'm sitting there saying in heroic raid, I get the feelings and the thoughts that I am better off being outside the raid and watching someone's Discord stream. Your complexity's gone too far, even on the second highest level of raiding, where you don't even need to add these quote mythic mechanics. And I think he's not always understanding that point. Yes, add-ons are impacting, and obviously this is a conversation about UI and add-ons, so that's where the focus is going to be. But I think and I hope that they are also thinking about the fact that the rest of their encounter design needs to be thought about in a different way.
Things to land. It also definitely ties our hands in some ways. Like, I think we do fewer coordination mechanics than we used to. Like, there used to be,
That's
like,
true.
Look at old school WoW days. There were encounters where, like, the primary challenge for your raid was by design coordinating some rotation. And the execution beyond that wasn't super complicated, but making sure that this thing stayed soaked, or that you were rotating people through with their debuff or whatever, that became a big part of the fight's challenge. Now we know ultimately that that can never be the thing that we lean on for challenge, because it's going to be solved, and it's not going to be solved through what we think of as the more just interesting MMOE like communication, cooperation, figuring out systems for having these things work in a way that feels collaborative. It's going to be downloading the weak aura pack, setting it up appropriately, maybe having 3 or 4 frustrating wipes because there was a typo in the configuration, which is that's not what I think anyone really wants raiding to be.
Yep.
And so we move away from making those mechanics as much, and lean more on things that add-ons can't solve for you, like moving out of a swirly under your feet with only a little bit of time to respond. I don't think it's a coincidence that more and more of our fights have those sorts of just twitch reaction, avoidance mechanics, whereas that used to be one type of fight that we did. The design space is definitely constrained by the knowledge that, if we lean on.
It's funny he says twitch reaction, because the timing on a lot of mechanics definitely doesn't always feel fair as a result. You eventually just get used to it and you go for it, but there's a level of player that type of mechanic is never going to feel fair. And some of it is class design, some of it is spec design that plays into that. Do they have the tools that they need in order to survive a fight? But, I raid with a lot of people in their 40s and 50s. Let's just be real. I'm closer to 40 than not. Our reaction times are not the same as they were 20, 30 years ago. And now you're asking us to essentially flick shot your character out of a mechanic, where even the hitboxes of those aren't always 100% accurate. I've stood outside of the big thing that I think of is, at least in this current patch, is the beams in Mechagon third boss. Those fire beams are bigger than what the fire beam is. How are we supposed to know that? So, Twitch reaction fights, I think it definitely gets dull to do them over and over and over again, but at the same time, I understand why they feel like they have to go that route. There's got to be a better way to do it, and I'm not smart enough to do it, so we'll see. I don't know. It's just kind of a rambling thought.
On it too heavily, it's just going to get trivialized.
Some of my favorite WoW raid boss memories are bosses like Mythic Unat, Mythic Anduin. You have to spread out and then you get these marks and you have to go to the right places. And there used to be definitely a library of mechanics like that, where you would get them and then you'd have to think, and you'd have to have a system, and you'd have to have 20 players sort of coordinate and become one team that does a mechanic like that. And the fact now that add-ons take on much of that job of coordinating us, I think that almost all the Mythic Raiders I know would be delighted to move back to a world where we did that in our brains, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Dragonflight, we saw a little bit of an attempt to make that happen, right, with the private aura system. And what ended up happening was we still had the weak aura, but now we also have a macro that we need to press, and then the weak aura will assign us the same thing. So I'm a little bit worried. How's the arms race between the weak aura devs trying to come up with a new way around the restriction that you're putting in? Is this just a further escalation in that?
Hopefully not. I think our goal here is kind of disarmament and definitely not further escalation. I think we understand that if we're not going to try more little targeted things like that are going to encourage workarounds, and it just ends up with this back and forth. Because if there is a way to solve a complex mechanic, but you have to jump through a couple of more hoops to do so, you'll do that, and then just be more annoyed by the process. Our goal is to try to get out of that space entirely.
Good.
So I think down the line eventually, that may mean, I think, some broader restrictions on specifically what information add-ons have access to about combat events in real time. At the same time, we know that that's not a thing that we could just do right now without providing a lot more on our end, both in terms of just UI type functionality, but also looking at how we're designing some encounters, how some of our classes work. I think there are tons of add-ons that are healthy and valuable and really important to how players play the game that do rely on that flow of information. Everything from something as simple as damage meters to honestly boss time, ability timelines, the DBM style, when is this next ability going to fire, that people have basically been raiding with forever. That's not the like computational weak auras. That's just, hey, this ability is going to happen in 15 seconds. Like we want to build in our own version of that. Like I think like down the
Good.
line, we'd love to see a place where there is a boss timeline as just part of the encounter UI, and that's not something you need an add-on for. And that way we can hopefully eventually get to a point where we're really just cutting out the weak aura that solves the mechanic for you, but not the informational stuff that you feel like, it really feels like the game should have been telling you all along. Whereas
Yes.
are, admittedly,
Oh my God, yes.
Okay,
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. DBM bigwigs, that style of add-on should have been in this game 18 years ago. It should have been a TBC feature. Like, the fact that it's taken 20 years for them to get to this point is beyond frustrating. But I will take better super fucking late than never.
so coming in 11.1.7, we're going to have the rotation helper, those two options. What of the rest of this initiative, is any of the rest of this in 11.1.7, or are we just starting the conversation now?
I think there's a lot of stuff that we're working on. I think, yeah, we've seen the cooldown manager and then the rotation assist coming. I think down the line, it's some of the stuff that I touched on. I don't have specific patch dates right now, but we are looking at damage meters. We're looking at nameplate improvements. We are
In-game damage meters, I think, could be very good or very bad. I'm worried about frame rate issues with it trying to log all that shit. Nameplate overhaul should have been done with the Dragonflight overhaul and wasn't somehow. But we'll see.
are looking at, like a raid encounter information presentation that shows you timeline of boss abilities coming up. Things in that general space. I think we're looking at all the places where players say right now, you need this weak aura, you need this add-on to, be competitive, and asking ourselves, like, how do we change our game to make that not the case? And some of that's going to be add-on functionality, or UI functionality. Other aspects are going to be looking at how we're building some encounters or how some class mechanics work. Like, I think it's super fair to, point at some specs, like, let's say Outlaw Rogue, who I know are, easy one to pick on in some of these ways, and ask, like, how is anyone really supposed to execute this perfectly with the base UI? Almost any time we're tracking, like, stacks of a buff, and you need to make a decision where it's like, if you're between 4 and 7 stacks, you should do this, otherwise don't. Those are not reasonable tests for us to be posing to our players without providing them the information to do it correctly. And so we need to either provide the information, simplify the mechanic, or both.
There are a lot of players who love the version of Outlaw Rogue that it has existed over the past few years. So I think there's always some fear when this discussion starts up of, is the answer going to be to simplify everything? And I think it's really exciting to hear instead that the answer is, okay, we'll maybe simplify some of these huge outliers, but we're going to bring in the functionality that makes it so that instead of needing to download a weak aura to solve this, right, instead of needing to have a complicated assistant tell you, now you're supposed to press this button, now you're supposed to press this button, instead we're going to provide that information in a more clear way than looking at the top right of your screen to see your buffs and trying to catch the rotation buff between all the other 20 that are changing in combat.
That's definitely the goal. I think we want World of Warcraft to be as approachable as possible, but we also love that the skill ceiling in the game is as incredibly high as it is. That allows for tons of differentiation and self-expression and accomplishment. But I think, a lot of, at its core, a lot of skill in WoW, I think, boils down to multitasking ability. And like even just, you might be able to do amazing damage just testing it against a target dummy. Very different world when you're also in an encounter and need to do 3 mechanics at the same time. And
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. It's really, really funny to me that, like, and I've had this experience personally. Like I said, I raid lead, and so the demands on my brain during a raid are much higher as I'm trying to call timers because it just helps people trigger it, even though everyone in the raid has like a DBM bigwig style add-on. But my DPS, whether it's Windwalker or now on Evoker, is going to be less. And then I get into a key situation where either I'm not shot calling or the shot calling doesn't require as much. And I've had people from my own raid team literally go, holy shit, you're doing damage. It's like, well, yes, because I'm not having to worry about my stuff, but I'm also not having to worry about your stuff. And some of that like comes down to should players be able to handle more things? Like I shouldn't have to sit there and call, hey, big bad bomb coming out in 10 seconds. Like everyone should be able to see and process that. I think what a good raid leader does is they go, okay, we've got this cooldown here that we want to use, or hey, odd groups are soaking this one, even groups are soaking this one, or hey, full energy's coming, get ready to move, or hey, you're at 80%, boss phase is at 79%, get ready to move. Those are the types of stuff that I really enjoy, or we call spreads for certain mechanic on how we want to handle it. And sometimes it's even better to, like, the most fun raid leading I've had is the stuff that, like, Kaivetsu is one of my favorite bosses to raid lead because there was like 5 different ways to handle that depending on what your players would do. So if someone didn't get out as fast because they're a priest or a warlock or a DK with their shadow buff, like you had to adjust how you would place your portals and how you would run against your portals. Like, okay, now we need a staggering or stampeding roar, or we need a wind rush totem. You know, the variability in how you handle that fight is fine. And then I would just do simply like, circles are coming out, get ready to move, or dashes are coming. I don't have to sit there and explain it. I can say, hey, dashes are out. Let's go try to get them to the edge. Just a reminder of what our strategies are. And then go, okay, we had one cross right through the middle of the raid. It's sitting in the sitting just off center. So we're going to need to move left here so that we don't get sucked into this, this pit of despair. Like that's the type of raid leading that I really, really enjoy. And that's from a AOTC early to mid mythic level raid leader. And so simplifying things across the board, I think is really good. And building in the base information, I think is really good. And they talked about simplification. Like I think they really need to pursue it, both on the mechanic side, but also on the class side.
You see, tunnel visioning DPS are a meme for a reason, right? They're just focused on their rotation, and whoops, they just messed up the encounter mechanic, or vice versa. Someone who is good at mechanics, but their DPS goes off a cliff. Really, like the function of a lot of these add-ons is to offload a portion of that computational complexity, and we recognize, like, if we are removing some of that functionality, we're providing more information, we can probably remove a couple of mechanics, but still keep the same level of challenge. The goal is not to make
same level of challenge is done through true DPS checks. This game has gotten away from true damage checks. And, people are like, oh, I just stood still and hit a boss. Like, having a fight like that every couple of expansions, I think is a really, really good thing. Like, they need to bring back a patchwork style boss that has a maniacal tank buster, that has a maniacal healing check where you have to heal or cooldown it every minute, or has like this constant ticking damage, so your healers are always having to do this like slow restorative work, and then your DPS just don't really have to think about anything except zug zug. It can be an early boss. They make it a third boss or fourth boss, but it needs to be a rock hard DPS check. I get looked at very strangely when I say this a lot, but the game is better when DPS are generally the ones that are having the least amount of fun. And that's a whole video soapbox episode. But I want to see more encounters where how much damage you do is good, and then I want to see a fight where the damage check is really easy, but your mechanics check is really hard. Like, they need to do the extremes on these every now and then, and they don't. And it's wild to me. And because of that, it appeals to the strengths of different players. Like, I've got a raid member that's, Ian mentioned them, they're very good at mechanics, but their DPS isn't great. And then I've got the reverse, that when they're alive, they're pretty good damage. They just can't live to save their damn life. And it's because there's no fight that actually plays into their strengths. Every fight is one-shotty. Every fight is constant target switching. Every fight is constant dodging. You're always moving. You don't really get to sit down and actually feel like you're contributing at all. Liberation of Undermine is a good raid, but it's plagued by these very significant problems that prevent it from being a great raid to me.
Make it easier. The goal is to make it less complex. And I think that's, I think is a key distinction there, because I think it often can sound like, oh, this is about, this might be about dumbing down the game or simplifying things. It's not that. It's about trying to create a more approachable baseline experience that still has every bit as much room for differentiation.
When you were talking about add-ons that things have been in the game, been inspired by it, you mentioned a damage meter.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in just what your view is, philosophy-wise, about damage meters in games like this.
That's a great question, and I think ultimately we have to be guided by what our community prefers and what we see them doing today. The single most popular add-on used across the entire game is a damage meter by like a fair margin.
Okay.
The majority of players, the large majority of players, have a damage meter add-on installed. And so that indicates that people want to see that information at least about themselves. We definitely want more nuanced measures of success and understanding, like how successful were you or how much did you contribute on this run, highlighting things like interrupts, highlighting things like avoidable damage to give a fuller picture of performance.
Good.
But at the end of the day, I think for someone who's trying a new spec, trying a new talent build, getting a new trinket, and they want to see like how did this affect my performance compared to the last run, that's an important piece of information to have. And so I think we know that in any world where we were going to limit some of the ability of add-ons to, like, again, do that real-time combat event tracking, we would need to provide a damage meter solution of our own. And I think one of the exciting things is, I think if we're doing that on our end, we can also have it be server authoritative, so you're not worried about like who's in a different combat phase, who's out of range, or whatever.
Yeah.
It could just be like, this is official and going to be accurate all the time.
We're obviously
I also got a hint of I fucking hate it, but our players demand it, so I have no choice. So I might as well figure out the best way to do it. I don't know about you, I got that vibe. My opinion on damage meters is that I think people use it entirely wrong. There's a phrase that absolutely tilts me off this fucking galaxy called my parse, where people say, but my parse. And now my guild knows that I don't like it. They say it mostly is a way to joke, and I mean, they don't actually do that. But there are people out there that all they care about is being first on the damage meter or first on the healing meter. And those people do, and frankly, and some people just don't understand the vast amount of information that you can gain out of your damage meter. And because of that, I think that people, for the most part, use damage meters incorrectly. They don't look at and understand what is causing things to be that way. And Details has done a much better job over the years to do things like putting counter breakdowns, and you can use an in-game compare tool where if you have two destruction warlocks, you can look at both and say, okay, here's where some damage difference was. Oh, this is why this warlock is significantly ahead of this warlock. They both lived the whole fight, but this warlock got off 35 more casts than the other one. Okay, there's something that we need to, as a person that wants to see every single person on a raid team have success and feel like they're contributing. Stuff like that is super valuable to me, but a lot of players don't understand how you can use that. Warcraft Logs is another tool that people just don't understand how you can use it. They look at the all-star points, they look at your parse percent and think that, oh, I only got a 75% parse percent, or I got a 25% parse percent, I suck, or 75, I'm okay. Oh, I got 99, I'm one of the best there is. But they don't understand exactly the level, what that information tells you. They don't understand the why, they just look at the what. And so I'm worried about that in a in-game damage meter. I do like the fact that they can make it server side, which fixes a lot of the issues that I have with Details. and Warcraft logs for that example, for that matter as well. Um, so I'm excited about that prospect. But yeah, I just had to get my thoughts on damage meters out.
Mostly thinking about Mythic Raid when our brains go to how this is going to affect things, but the overwhelming majority of players are
Yeah.
in heroic raids, normal raids, raid finder raids, doing Mythic Plus dungeons, right? When we're talking about making these changes to what WeakAuras can do, is there an appetite for changing how heroic and normal raids function as well? Like, do we see these problems in there as well for what add-ons can do and how they solve things?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it all trickles down, right? I mean, I think maybe even more a larger percentage of players doing Mythic Raid might use specific weak aura packs than, let's say, normal. But those add-ons are used by the majority of players right now, and certainly other boss mods are as well. And I think a lot of it just comes down to what are the coordination challenges that we're presenting. If there's something that everyone is relying on a tool right now to assist with, we would have to change it to still keep it the same level of challenging, but without that same automation assistance. And that can take many forms. It can be there's one or two fewer things to soak. You have an extra couple of seconds to actually spread out on the fly. It's a pretty common mechanic of all right, 3 people get a debuff and they just have to run out in different directions from each other. People have been just kind of playing the game and doing those for years and years. But of course, if you can if the time you're given to react is so tight that you can't afford to do that, then people do gravitate towards, all right, we're going to put diamond, circle, and triangle on the ground. Everyone's going to get an auto-assigned marker, and you just know, I'm going to run to my marker to guarantee that it's executed correctly. I think it's a bit more interesting if we give you a couple of seconds so that you can look around and make sure you're not running in the same direction, and then do the exact same thing.
Agreed.
At the end of the day, raiding in particular, but group PvE, group PvP too. In an MMO, a huge portion of, I think, the fun of it is just
Oh, hey,
coordination,
Kazara.
communication, feeling like everyone's working together.
Dire Maul, really?
Some challenge in front of them. And I think getting back into a
Shock.
place where there's room
Great
for
boss.
more of that organic collaboration, as opposed to it just being regimented and solved by an external tool, I think it will open up a lot of design avenues.
I agree. I love figuring out. I'm someone that by the time I get to a boss, say on heroic or mythic, that the strategies have been well figured out already. But that doesn't mean that the strategies that generally speaking have been figured out are going to be the best. They might have there are guilds that are going to have the strategy because they have a consistent mage. I don't have one right now. There are guilds that might have this consistent strategy because they have 3 monks. I have 1. So we have to figure out how to adapt, and then getting a little bit more time to be able to figure out that adaptation, I think, is really good. A lot of the messaging that I've heard 25 minutes or so into this podcast is that there is a desire for information that Blizzard wants to now put native to their game, which I love, but there is also a very strong opportunity for them to simplify and fix things that have become too fast. Because there is such a thing particularly in MMOs, as too fast. A lot of people love Souls-like games because there are things that are very precise. And if you don't hit things at a precise moment, you're taking a lot of damage, or your boss fight's extended 30 seconds, or you're dead. But in MMOs, you don't need that level of precision because it's the only genre, and WoW's the only game where you're coordinating with a large group of people. I coordinate with more people in my WoW raid than I coordinate with at my job. One of them pays me. The other I'm going to do for fun. And so finding ways to simplify that coordination or allow things to happen much more organically and allow more people to feel like they can contribute, I think is nothing but a good thing. Take some of the load off raid leaders and put it back into the players to make decisions for themselves. I love that idea.
For the game going forward.
Throughout the last couple years, especially in Mythic Plus, that had been ramping in complexity, you've seen, and actually if you can go back, you can see the amount of things that people have in their UI to help them know that something's happening. So like back in Power Auras, it was, you know, there was just some giant,
Power Auras.
some giant face on your screen would pop up, and that meant that something procced. And then it's gotten more, you know, refined. And now, even in the last, it's been ramping the past couple of years. You see like, you listen to someone's POV who's doing High Mythic Plus right now. You're going to hear AOE, dodge, frontal, circle. Like it's just every bit of audio aid they've used to, you know, it's in the idea of being optimal. It's not required. And especially this patch, I think Mythic Plus complexity has actually gone down as an intentional design point. It seems, at least. I think you might have made a post about that. So that stuff is less required, but people have like kind of already baked that in the UI. Is that something that you're looking to either have an ability to have that in the game, or is that something you don't want to have happen, where it's more like you're organically doing mechanics because you see them, or are you okay with all of the audio and visual aids that exist currently within add-ons?
I think the answer is mixed there. I think like audio prompts are something that are super valuable to people. That's something we want to continue to add support for on our end as well. Like we know we've got feedback we've gotten around the 11.1.5 cooldown manager would be that many people would appreciate being able to have audio prompts tied to certain things or procs firing, and that's something they would miss about weak auras. We want to make sure that we're offering that kind of thing as well. Beyond that, I mean, I think a lot of what we've seen is, frankly, us not doing a sufficiently good job of telegraphing the importance of certain mechanics and their impact, and players needing to come up with solutions for them externally.
Yes.
Ideally, you know, there's a concept that we call affordance, which is basically just what is, like, how well is something telegraphed? How intuitive is it with visual presentation? And ideally, the affordance of a mechanic should match its impact. And sometimes, yeah, if you have a random mob in a dungeon pack that has a frontal that will just delete you if you're not getting out of the way of it, and it's just one thing going on among a half dozen other things, why? And why? Like, how could we call that out better with visuals, with a longer cast time, with how we're creating the pack in the first place? And that's just one example of one of the areas in which we know we can do better. You know, something else we've talked about on the UI front is we would want the ability to, on our end, flag mob casts in Mythic Plus as like lethal, as like this should be a high priority interrupt, because we know players are going to basically look to solve that anyway.
I love that. And correct. As someone that loves Mythic Plus, it's my favorite mode in the game, and it's not even close. I raid so that I can Mythic Plus better. I agree with that. I think that finding a way to natively flag important kicks is a good thing. But I also kind of agree with his idea that mix, because I mean, I have met people and I talk to people that are in, you know, the well-known Hard of Hearing Guild Undaunted, that visual aids are going to be very important to their success because they can't hear the audio cues, or they struggle to hear the audio cues, so they have to find a different way to go about making stuff work considering the accessibility that they require. Audio cues, I know a lot of people, I'm this way. I'm an auditory learner. If you want to teach me things, talk to me about them. Don't shove a book in front of me. Talk to me about them. You tell me to read an instruction manual, I'm going to throw that shit back in your face and say, fuck you. Well, not really. I mean, I try to let people know, hey, I'm an auditory learner. You've got to find a way to make, like, you can't just put everything in text. Give me a short video prompt. Give me text-to-speech ability so that I can, like, listen to it and explore it at the same time. And so audio prompts for someone like me are actually very valuable because it's a lot of how I learn and retain information. So having a sound pack natively built in, I think, is a good option, frankly.
If there are 3 casters in a pack, and 2 of them, it's actually kind of okay to let them free cast, but one of them, if they ever get a cast off, you're probably going to wipe. They shouldn't all just look indistinguishable on your screen, and us expect you to figure that out on your own.
They did that in season 1, right? Wasn't there like a couple casts or like super giga you die death volley or something?
Yeah.
And they had this big animation.
The Arcara casters where they hunker down, there's green glowy stuff around them, and they're casting a volley, and you're like, all right, I gotta kick
You'd
that.
be playing WoW for 2 days, and you're like,
That's not happening,
that can't happen. Yes.
But I'm looking forward to an M+ then, where if we're talking about maybe taking away my ability to air horn myself on a certain cast, something like that, if instead I have to be now looking at a mob and there is a sort of a visual language that I can come to expect, like if the mob is hunkering down and it's got particle effects around it, that means I gotta kick it. I think that would be more fun for everybody as well, rather than having the air horns be the solution.
Definitely.
That is entirely our hope, right? I think, and just
Good.
super
I like
clear,
that.
you know, I think we see the taking away part, the restricting functionality, as the end of this long road. I think we know, we want to make it very clear, we're not sitting here being like, all right, we want you to play the game the way we intended, and we're going to take away your tools. We just want to bridge that gap. And we have a lot of work to do on our end to keep building up more improvements, more functionality. And it's, again, it's not just the UI. The VFX changes that you mentioned are a part of that overall effort of us asking,
Good.
what are the places where players feel like they need add-ons to succeed? Why is that the case? And when it's like, it's not clear when you're standing in something, and so I need, GTFO or some other, sound effect to let me know that I'm standing in something lethal, it should be obvious. Let's fix that on our end. And we know we want to keep chipping away at those things and hopefully eventually get to a point where really the only difference between what we are offering and what powerful add-ons can do is that small subset of like computational problem solving stuff, at which point we can move forward.
So throughout the evolution of private auras, we've seen, initially when they came out, they were like kind of, a lot of friction was involved, and then I think they were done really, really well in a couple of cases, starting in Amir Drasil, where they were a mechanic like P1 Fire Act. You had the circles you had to quickly spread out for. They were pretty fast, but they were too fast to use a macro for it, and it basically forced the players into something they would have used a weak aura for, to just do the mechanic normally. And like, are there lessons you've learned there of like, this is actually how we can design mechanics or kind of assignment things going forward? And then also, is this, if done successfully, would this also remove private auras as what would have been, I guess, kind of a temporary solution to the weak aura problem?
Yeah, we've definitely learned a lot from how private auras have rolled out. Certainly we understand that if we're ever using it on something that like is on a long enough time frame that macros are going to let you solve it and it's punishing enough to not solve it, all we're doing is creating an extra annoying hoop to jump through, and we like fixed off the private aura designation from some of those back in Amir Drasil, and we've let that shape how and where we use or don't use it going forward. And so yeah, I think examples like the Furak mechanic that you mentioned are ones where like when we know that everyone is in a level playing field, everyone just has to play the game, play the mechanic. We can tune it accordingly so that it's hard but doable. We'd like to be able to do more of that for sure.
Yeah,
Good.
I see the Fire Act first intermission, which was a private aura and then had to get hotfixed off of the private aura, as sort of a cautionary tale for if there's a mechanic that is only doable with the weak aura assignments, and then we take away that without giving an adequate replacement, then it's worse than doing nothing at all. What would a mechanic like that look like in a world where we don't have a computational solution to it, right? Would it be slower and fewer sets of like lower damage numbers on these things?
I think probably a bit of all of that. There's multiple knobs there. There's, on Mythic we might default to like everyone in today's world, everyone in the raid has to participate in this, and there's enough things to be soaked that if anyone isn't doing it, it's not going to work out. Versus maybe shifting to a world where there's a little bit more slush, things are a little bit slower, there's a little bit more time to react, to get into place organically based on which buff you were assigned, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, our goal here is to preserve challenge, and we know that we'd have to design encounters differently in some cases to deliver roughly the same level of challenge in terms of how many pull counts it takes, just what progression looks like, while living in a different mechanical world. And I know that when we talk about restricting any kind of add-on functionality, many players very rightly, kind of reflexively say or ask, well, how am I supposed to do this boss in this tier without my weak aura? That would be impossible. And the reality is, if you couldn't use that weak aura, that mechanic would be designed or tuned differently. We would have ended up nerfing it right away or designing it differently over the course of even just PTR testing. And so that's like any future design in this space will have to be built from the ground up with that in mind. And I think it's
Good.
making it a little bit more forgiving in a way that makes the challenge human rather than superhuman, as it often is when we're looking at like cutting edge mythic tuned things. Because I mean, you guys are really good at the game, as it turns out, and we want to make a boss that is going to pose a challenge and is going to take you dozens of attempts, let alone 100 plus to beat. We do have to take into account the fact that not just you, but every Mythic raid guild that's going to follow in your footsteps are going to be using these tools. And at the end of the day, I think players do want challenging bosses. That if, we just tuned the boss around none of those things, players used all those tools, and they went in and like a late mythic boss was dying in a single night for like, a cutting edge guild, rank 500 or whatever, that probably doesn't match what they're looking to get out of mythic rating, in my estimation. And so like our goal is to keep the same overall level of challenge while paring down the complexity a little bit.
Even if you look at the history of bosses this would have affected,
Which you do via damage and healing checks.
you actually, even looking at Mythic Plus, something where the complexity has gone down from pack to pack in this patch, but the reality is you can still find challenge in it because it's infinitely scaling, and you will get to a point where it's doing too much damage to you, or the amount of damage you need to do is too high. There's been Mythic bosses that have been simple mechanically, but have been unbelievably difficult, and that's been true all the way down the guild ranks. It's not something that's just nerfed.
Sludge Fist. I knew they were going to show Sludge Fist.
Where you've created really intricate problems.
Funny enough, they mentioned 2 of the best bosses of the last 3 expansions.
To solve where weak ores basically didn't matter. Halandris, you actually
Another
put a
one.
bomb timer very clearly in the game around the bomb. You did not need a weak ore for one of the hardest bosses ever, right? It's more just basically the solution for these weak ores has been just a very specific kind of assignment mechanic that is just like, oh, it's just so much easier to do this, right? You could build in a lot of that computational stuff in game to where
Why are we showing
weak
Zithkarn?
ores existed. You would find people just being like, I don't know, the game just kind of does it. We have players that don't use audio sounds in weak ore packs because on bosses like Skarn, on most other bosses, there's like either an in-game sound for when the bombs are actually activating, or a voice line. We have 2 players in our guild that use very minimal weak ores, and they literally listen to voice lines for when mechanics are going to happen, and it's extremely accurate, right? So I think a lot of these things are already built into the baseline game. It's just about choosing like when and how to apply them.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think your example, going back to Nathri of Sludge Fist, I think is a great one, right? Like a lot of that was just practice and just learning like how to react to these situations when chained to different partners and dodging the stuff. And people were in enough situations over enough time, they kind of develop that muscle memory, that sense of planning, and eventually your guild as a whole.
Oh, don't show SLG.
Compared to, let's say, the Stone Legion generals that came after it, a couple of issues there, but like one of the central mechanics that was being solved by weak auras was like, all right, there's a whole bunch of soaks that need to be covered over the course of the fight, and it's not realistic to have that like 7 to 8 soaks up simultaneously, where you need to also account for like, well, this person just got targeted by different mechanics, so they need a backup to go in and do it for them.
Yeah, so it sounds initially like it's, we're restricting what add-ons can do, but really we're opening up the universe.
Real quick, because again, I'm going to harp on this point. What is the big reason that Sludge Fist is so loved? It was a hard damage check. Yes, the chaining was there, but you had, and some of it's still kind of flawed design because you would have like 3-minute classes that just got absolutely fucked, but like minute classes were living life. But what happened is that you would have these periods of, like, Sludge Fist was great because it was well paced. Like, you would have these periods of pacing, of slower pace, where you're just trying to live, get your chains, don't kill each other, don't vengeful retreat away from your warlock who can't demonic portal. And then the charge would happen, and you're all in on doing as much damage as you can, and then you rinse and repeat. But the thing about Sludge Fist is you had 4 pillars. That fight did not need an enrage timer because it had one built in. And it was a hard damage check. Even on Heroic. It was a hard damage check on Heroic. We're sensing a theme here, I think.
Universe of mechanics that can exist in a WoW boss without, because there are so many that you could think of right now where all of them would be, this is going to get solved by this, right? This is going to get solved by this, but if that's not the answer, then now the designers have all these tools back, and we can get these mechanics that maybe haven't been used since MOP because we've been weak-oring them ever since, and now we get to solve them with our brains again.
And he even mentioned, too, he said, like, well, there's a lot of swirlies now.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like, oh, we can always default to this and a few other things because you're not going to solve that with weak, so we can add fights where that's not a thing. But, you remove that, that friction of there's too many swirlies goes away. And I think there's assignment, like doing a lot of these assignment bosses without a weak aura that could work would be like really fun. Like it's fun to do that. It's fun when you have 5 people that need to soak something, like the last phase of Gallywix. There's a frontal on a side of a room, and 2 people die. And right now, WeakOr is just like, okay, well then we're going to sign backup. So these 2 people get a big green thing on their screen, go soak that. That is something where that fight is spread out enough where you could actually communicate that. We need 2 people on the right to back up because 2 soakers are dead. Who can do it? This person says something, this person says something. Now, obviously, you're not going to have that kind of communication like heroic and normal. Maybe it won't be in comms, whatever, but in Mythic, that's perfectly reasonable, right? A lot of the things, like, we could probably count, honestly, on 1, maybe 2 hands over the last, like, 4 or 5 years, how many bosses would you meaningfully would have to have a mechanic change. But they are very impactful, very memorable, and they have been purely defined by that. Are you worried at all about the community's, and this has certainly been ramping up over time. Like you mentioned, even for us, we were much more just do the mechanic 4 or 5 years ago than we are now. Are you worried that there has been this built-in reliance on it that might be hard to shake when creating new raid bosses?
The answer is yes, by the way.
Absolutely. And I think that some of that gets back to us knowing that we need to really ease into this, that any world where we just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and say, all right, have fun,
honestly,
we're in a new world, as opposed to building up more built-in functionality, starting to have clearer visuals, simplify some mechanics, and then building counters and to have classes designed around a world where we know that this isn't possible. As long as people are set up for success, I think we'll be fine. Certainly, if we were to disable any functionality and then players went into a new tier and we're just wiping to bosses and they used to clear heroic comfortably and now they're brick walled halfway through heroic, yeah, players that will be a source of tremendous frustration. But we know that we need to avoid that by any means possible, and we have a lot of work to do before we get there.
Something that really encourages me is the ping system. That seems like
Yes.
the perfect way to give us an option to identify where we're going, right? You can just ping where you're going, and then you don't have to, try and communicate with words. Hey, I'm going to move over to the left 20 yards, right? Just ping where I'm going, and that opens up an ability to solve these again in a YOLO style, right, rather than an
I
assignment.
think your guild did that.
Yeah.
So the Echo of Neltharion, right?
Yeah, we just pinged it.
Yeah, so
for it,
famously,
yeah.
everyone had the maps for that. Here's your exact spot you go, and then his guild was like, you know what, everyone just ping your spot. Mostly it gets covered. People go to the same spot every pull. But if you see 2 pings in a spot, 1 person has to move, right? And that could largely solve a mechanic with just something that's already built into the game.
Yeah, I think and the ping system is something we've also talked about looking to.
I love the ping system.
Kind of broaden
I love
the
it.
sorts of things you can do with it, to give people more tools to solve these problems in a coordinated way, but using their own skill and expression instead of another tool.
Ping system is
Honestly, World
great.
of Warcraft, I'm always thinking back to when I first started playing the game, and there was this really exciting moment where I looked at it and I'm like, oh my god, I can make this game look however I want, right? I can put this here, I can have an add-on that tells me what time it is in London, what time it is in Darnassus, right? I can have all the world clocks there if I want. I can have 3 different bars at the bottom of my screen. I can do whatever I want there, and to me, that's always been a strength, not a weakness of WoW. So I think there's a lot of people that disagree with me on that, but then there's also people that they hear about Blizzard thinking about restricting add-ons and they're worried about losing that. Is there any intention to go after any of that kind of customization?
Not whatsoever. And in fact, we're doing everything we can to, and we would do everything we can down the line to minimize any collateral damage to them. But the goal is anything that's cosmetic should be completely fair game. All informational stuff that's out of combat, again, you have RP add-ons, help things that are tracking, helping with professions, tracking gathering nodes, helping you with quests.
Break TSM.
Name it, a bunch of accessibility add-ons, all of those.
Break TSM.
There's nothing harmful whatsoever about any of them. The
Bullshit, there's nothing harmful about them. TSM fucking ruins the auction house.
only thing is, at the very end of the day, once we feel like we've done enough on our end to improve baseline functionality, what we'd be looking at is the ability to parse real-time combat events in a way that drives, problem solving on the fly.
So it's kind of, we build the scaffolding to then be able to take away the existing WeakOr solutions that we have for these. How much of this is, so the thing that's excited me also about edit mode has been, it's so clearly based on what the community has learned over 20 years, right? It's oh, the community has revolved around this as a solution for presenting this information. Let's give them that base in the UI rather than making them download something. How much of this initiative is
I just got an
still
idea.
going to be based on what the community says, how the community reacts, versus which of these things are already kind of locked in decisions?
I'd say basically nothing here is locked in.
Okay.
Really, my hope today is to kind of begin a conversation about that direction and what areas are welcome, what areas maybe have more to do to convince the community on, and what areas we might be wrong on and should, reconsider. Because I think at the end of the day, this game belongs first and foremost to our millions of players. We're trying to serve them as best we can in the long run. And I think our sense is that for many players, the feeling that they have to download and use certain add-ons in order to play the game competitively isn't really part of what's attractive about the game or healthy in the long run. And so if we can pull things back to a place where add-ons are available for those who want to use them, but people aren't feeling pressured by their groups, by just the natural demands of competition and not wanting to lose out to someone who's using more advantages, then that's going to be the healthier route in the long run.
So if I was the kind of person who wanted to write a 10-paragraph forum manifesto, this would be one of the topics to do it on, right?
Absolutely. We will be reading, we will be listening. I think this is a long path ahead. And
we're gonna stop right there. I'm pretty happy with this. I came in being like objectively pessimistic. Like I guess cooldown manager, I really like the ideas behind it, but I don't think it's anywhere near there yet. This rotation helper doesn't impact me at all, really. I'll probably play with it just to play with it, but for the most part, I don't think it is going to mean a lot for me. The built-in damage meter, nameplate overhaul, I'm very curious to learn more about over time. The built-in DBM, basically, I'd be very curious about. There's a lot of little things that I want them to do. I want them to add things like more customization options built in natively. So things like class-colored name bars or class-colored health bars. I would absolutely love to have things like item level on items in your bags without having to download a bag add-on or something like that in order to do that. I would like to see that. But the fact that they're not going after those types of add-ons and stuff like that means like people can still have their bag sorted in a way that is meaningful to them and things like that. I really, really like that. So I'm curious. Obviously, this is going to be a very slow rollout. We're going to have to monitor this over the next few years, but I was inspired by this video to kind of talk about things. So I've already got another video idea whirring around in my head. I'll probably try to plot that out over the next few days and try to record that and get that out sometime soonish, hopefully not too long, about like where I think they should be putting in their UI design time. And the things that I would like to see improved about the base UI as someone that uses it quite a bit. So be good on that. So very, very long video. If you hung out with me, I appreciate it very much. Until the next time, hope you all stay safe. Enjoy yourself. If you're having fun. Keep on gaming. We'll see you next time.